In this video, we'll talk about the backward design process and how to organize an instructional experience. So here's what we will cover. We'll talk about Robert Gagne's events of instruction. He has a detailed set of events he believes should happen in an effective instructional experience. We'll talk about the backward design process. This is the process through which you as the instructional designer would design an instructional experience. And we'll talk about a more simplified way to organize your instruction in a way that makes sense and is good for beginners to this field. First, what is backward design? Backward design is design for learning. The phrase backward design is a little bit newer, it's trendy, but the concept of backward design has been around as long as instructional design has been around. In backward design, you design an experience with the end in mind. That is, with where you expect your learner to be at the end of a learning experience. By using this process, you'll keep your teaching or instruction really focused. And this is learner-centered because you are really thinking about the learner, who they are, where you want them to be, not just the information you want to throw at them. And this does include active learning as well. You are basically required to incorporate active learning into this process because your learner is not going to get to where you want them to be, or you won't know that they've gotten there unless you incorporate some active learning along the way. That brings us to Robert Gagne. He is an educational psychologist that has had an outsized influence on the field of instructional design. He did develop the science of instruction. He asked, what would you have to know in order to perform a given task after being given only instructions? So imagine you've been given something new to do. What do you need to do it? This can vary quite a bit, as you imagine, depending on what the task is. So anyways, he came up with 9 events that he believes makes a complete instructional experience. The very first one is probably going to make sense. Gain attention. If your learner is not paying attention, they are not learning. Next up, inform learners of objectives. If they don't know what to expect from an experience, it's harder for them to pay attention to what's important and to organize this information into their own experience and organize it in their own mind. If a new experience relates to a prior instructional experience or some prior knowledge a learner has, that should be part of a learning process. That would be part of doing a really thorough learner analysis, figuring out where your learners are, where they have been, and building an experience really tailored to them. Number 4 is really simple. Present the content. You've got content. It's a video, it's reading, whatever. Present it. Provide some learning guidance. So if you're depending on who your learner is and their experience with the content, you might need to answer questions, check to see if they get it or not. Next up, you want to elicit performance. This, I use the term practice. You want them to practice whatever the task is, right? So that would be the performance. You want to see how they do. We want to provide feedback. This is where I always say that the magic happens in learning. Feedback is the mechanism by which we really learn. We figure out if we understand something or not, we get feedback on it, and then we can kind of cement it into our long-term memory and move on. Finally, have the learner really try it out, whatever the task is, the thing you want them to do. This is the final assessment. Assess it, figure out if they can do it or not, and then finally, I like that it includes this one. This one's kind of hard to do. Enhance retention and transfer to the job. So it's not enough that a learner is able to do something in like a classroom setting or in an online course. Generally, if this is something you want them to use in a larger context, you need to kind of help them retain that and also transfer it to whatever that other context is. Because, for example, the classroom is not the real world, and the online course is not necessarily the real world. You want someone to be able to take whatever they've learned in your context and take it out to their context. That's hard to do. In any case, these are a lot of steps, right? 9 events is kind of a lot if you're new to instructional design and creating your first sort of learning or instructional experience. I like to focus on just the items that are bolded here when we're talking about backward design and organizing instruction for you as a new learning designer, as a new instructional designer. I think it's really important that you focus on objectives, focus on the content, you do practice and feedback. Feedback and practice, to me, these are basically the same sort of event going on, and assess performance. So let's look at how this looks to you as a designer. The backward design process simplified would be, first off, you come up with the learning objectives. Where do you want your learner to be? What do you want them to be able to do? What do you want them to know? And remember, it's not just enough to say what you want the learner to know. You need them to do something to show that they know it, okay? So you are always looking for a specific behavior. Yes, it's a little behaviorist, but you're always looking for a specific behavior that you can measure. You can't measure what's just in someone's mind without them doing something, okay? So keep that in mind. Learning objectives are really important. They are the method by which you keep everything else nice and in line, and there's no extraneous information. Right, so you decide where you want your learners to be, and then you figure out how you're going to measure whether or not they've gotten there. The assessment could be simple, a multiple choice test. If they are able to complete this test successfully at a certain grade or above, I know they've met the learning objectives, for example. It could be if you're at work and say you have someone working in a store and need them to do a closing procedure. The assessment could be, can they close successfully on their own? Do they follow all the steps, do all the tasks needed to successfully close the store? That would be this assessment, for example. It really depends on where you are and what you're trying to accomplish. All right, so again, this is the process as you experience it as the designer. These are the steps in order that you would move through. Okay, so you come up with the objectives, you come up with the assessment. Next, content. This one's probably pretty easy. This could be a video, it could be a reading, it could be you sit and chat with someone and give them the content, it could be a lecture. I mean, it can take a million different forms, and generally it's okay if it's a little bit more passive. Finally, you come up with a practice and feedback. I generally recommend the practice and feedback should be pretty similar to the assessment. But again, what's really important is the feedback item here. Not just that they have practice at it, but that they're able to get feedback on their practice. So let's go into each of these in a little bit more detail. When you come up with your learning objectives, remember you need to use a verb in your learning objective, okay? The verb is the thing that they're going to be able to do after the learning experience is complete. Again, learning objectives should be specific, measurable, observable. Very important. Assessment. This is the second thing that you would design. This is a list of a few things that you might consider if you're creating an online experience. What this is, at its essence, is the final learning check, seeing if they've gotten to where they need to be. Content. Videos, reading, games, etc. Sometimes the content and the practice are kind of overlapping. That's totally fine. Generally, it's okay for content to be a passive experience as long as you don't have like 3 hours of a passive experience. I generally recommend kind of a 10 and 2 model for content. 10 minutes of passive content, 2 minutes of doing something. That's a really nice way to break up an educational experience, especially if it's online and the learner has to sit and deal with all this online. Next, practice and feedback. Could be games, unscored quizzes. It could be very similar, if not practically identical to the final assessment, because what better way to make sure that your learners are going to be successful than to have practice that looks a lot like the final assessment. In any case, it should be a low pressure experience. That's really important. No one learns well under pressure, so make this low pressure and make sure there's feedback built in. All right, so go ahead and pause here for a moment and complete this activity before we move on. So let's talk about how the learner experiences this. We've talked about backward design as a process by which you, the designer, create the learning experience. Here's how the learner experiences it. They're informed of learning objectives, great, so they know exactly what to focus on. They experience the content. They practice, they get feedback, and then they do the final assessment. Pretty simple, right? So as an example, a learning objective might be these students are in a tutorial where they're learning how to use a library. So the learning objective might be, you're going to be able to locate a book, okay? So the key verb here is locate. This is an active learning objective. We'll be able to measure whether or not the students have gotten there. They might watch a video on how to do this. They'll practice finding a book, and that could take the form, for example, of a simulation of the library website with hints. So kind of like a guided experience of the library website. It's ungraded, so the feedback's sort of built in there. And the final assessment is maybe it's a library website simulation with no hints, maybe it's the real library website, or it could also be a multiple choice question quiz in there as well. And it can take, again, any format that you choose that you think would align well to the original learning objectives. All right, go ahead and pause again and complete this short activity. Okay, recap. You, as the designer, when performing backward design, this is the order in which you come up with your design. You always start with the objectives and then the assessment, knowing how they are going to look, behave, what they'll know after they complete the learning objectives. And then you kind of figure out the content and the practice that helps them get, again, to that final assessment. And this is the order as the learners experience it. Okay, so they're informed of the objectives, they figure out what they need to know through the content, they do some practice, they get feedback, and then they have the final assessment. That's how the learner experiences it. You might have noticed throughout this short video, there's a couple of interactive moments. Those were practice activities for you. We're not going to do a final assessment in this video. Instead, we're going to have a module in class where we are talking about these topics, and you'll be able to kind of show what you know and if you master learning objectives or not for this module. In any case, backward design, you've got a good idea of what it is now. We've given you a simplified version of how to create an instructional experience that makes sense for your learners and would be effective. Always remember, focus on what you want learners to be able to do, and include only relevant content and activities. Always come back to your learning objectives. If something does not relate to the learning objectives, it probably doesn't need to be in your instructional experience. If you find that your instructional experience isn't complete without something, maybe you need to revisit your learning objectives and rewrite them to include that. All right, so I hope this was a good introduction to backward design and organizing your instruction. Again, this was kind of a simplified look at organizing your instructional experience. In the real world, you probably want to figure out how you can hit all those Gagne's 9 events, but that's something that you'll practice as you move on in your career.